Hi. So, contrary to what you may believe, this is not about video games. This is not about video games. This is about people like me. This presentation is describing the experience of language learning through the eyes of somebody who has experienced it in a very particular way, which I have come to realize that is not so particular. It's about virtual interaction. And one of the contexts in which you can experience virtual interaction is in video games. There are other mediums that you can use which will provide you with the same kind of experience, like movies or books. But I have found that video games have some particular conditions and characteristics that make them even more special and more effective in the process of learning a language. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my process. I'm going to tell you about who I was when I started this process of learning a language. There I was 11 years old, and I had very little knowledge of English at that time. Actually, I had no knowledge of English when I was 11. I also didn't have any special classes. I didn't go to study at the Colombo or FE. I didn't travel. And you know, I had no meaningful exposure to English. And classes at my school, even though it was a very good school, classes at my school were the typical English classes at a school that don't work. Verb to be from 4th grade to 11th grade. And at the end of 11th grade, they still don't know how to use verb to be. Which I believe is a terrible failure. If you think about it, algebra teachers teach the principles of algebra in 2 years. And most English teachers in schools cannot teach one verb in 7 years. So what does that tell us about the way we have been working? We need to start questioning those mechanics and those practices, because if they don't work, we need to look for other things that work. Now, I would like to know, like just quickly, raise your hand. How many of you learned English by taking language courses? I got one person over there. Two people that learned English through language courses. How about learning English by traveling? And the people who learned English studying their pedagogy studies. That means a lot of people who I have no idea how they learn, right? So that's a very interesting question. Apparently, traveling and taking English courses are not the only ways to learn a language. There are other ways. So, I would like to know about those people. Could you tell me how you learned?
I learned English through video games, through MMORPGs, and that's basically it. I didn't know English before, and I played a lot of video games. I've been playing a lot of video games. So when I came here to the university, I realized I could speak and understand English.
So I'm going to translate for all of you who can't hear. Now, he's been telling us that he learned English by playing video games, basically. And when he came to the university, he realized that he had the competences to communicate in English. Does anybody else have a similar experience? Wow, so it seems to be effective. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. So I was 11, no knowledge of English. And then I started doing different things. I started watching movies in English. Just because it was fun. I had no intention of learning English. This was basically a process that happened by accident. I always say I learned English by accident. I started watching movies in English, and when I was a kid, we didn't have cable TV. That's how long ago I was a kid. We didn't have TV. We had this gigantic antennas, looked like satellite dishes, and that's how we got international channels. So I started watching movies in English, because I love movies, and they just happened to have subtitles in English. And after I watched the first movie, I realized that I got the general idea. I got what the movie was about, even if I had no knowledge of English. So I got curious, and I continued. Another thing that I can tell you about myself is that I grew up in a time in which rock was the king. And that was a beautiful time to be alive. So I started listening to music, and I'm also a musician. I'm a singer, so I was singing music in English all the time. So I discovered Queen, Aerosmith, I discovered the Beatles, so many other bands, Scorpions. Later on, I discovered heavy metal, later on. But in that time, I was listening to rock, and rock was beautiful. And I was combining, without knowing, I was combining movies, music. Then I also started playing video games. I started playing video games in 1990. And video games in that time came either in Japanese or English. So I preferred English. It was closer to my culture. It was at least I could recognize the words, the letters. I could recognize the alphabet. So I started playing video games, and video games were not very heavy on language at that time, but they had some language. And I'm going to tell you more about this later, but I started picking up the language from the context of video games. And also, like 2 or 3 years later, I started reading books in English. My first book was one of the books of the Chronicles of Narnia. When I started reading, I was really lost. But about 20 pages in, I started getting the general idea. And by the end of the book, I could speak fluently. And my vocabulary was increased incredibly. Now, again, English classes at my school were to be from 4th grade to 11th grade. When I got to 11th grade, after like 7 years of doing these things, just doing those things without the intention of learning, they made us take a Michigan test. You know, the one that we call the method now. And in that time, just because of these strategies, I got a 91 in the Michigan test. So, and you know what? My score in grammar was 96. And I had never studied grammar. So, that's when I started asking people and wondering about my own process. And then I decided to study psychology. I went to the faculty and I started learning a little bit about linguistics, but in a very psychological way, based on trying to understand personality. But then I started realizing, as video games began progressing, they became more complex. I started realizing that people who play video games, and my friends who had the experience of playing video games, most of them were English speakers. And a few years later, I found a joke in Facebook, which became the origin, and that became the question for my thesis in my master's. It was this. I don't know if you can see it well. It says, video games teaching English since the 1980s better than English teachers. So, that is so common and so salient that it's a joke in Facebook. It's a meme. So we need to pay attention to those things. I started wondering, what about pedagogy? Because when I finished studying psychology, it was very clear to me that I didn't want to work as a psychologist. And while I was working on my thesis in psychology, I started wondering, what else can I do? Because I had to start paying these takes for my loan. So what else can I do? Well, I know English, let's teach. And I became an English teacher in an English institute that didn't have very high standards for teachers, because it was a kind of a questionable methodology, the one that they used. I think that they have been closed already, or they have lots of legal actions against it because of the way they bring students in. But that's not the point. The thing is, I started teaching English and I fell in love with this. I fell in love with the context. I realized that I had some skills, some talents, and I started learning about teaching. So after that, it's been like 15 years of studying pedagogy. And I believe that this is a topic that merits more research, because one of the things I found is that in the context of pedagogy, not much has been said about video games. Now, this brings me to the context, and here's what I have found. I kind of coined this concept of virtual interaction, because I feel that it's the only way to describe what happens when you're playing a video game. So, the question about what is virtual and what is real has also been a very important question to me. So I went to my roots. I went to psychoanalysis to try to understand what virtual reality is. We need to think about what we call real. So in psychoanalysis, we use what we call the 4 Borromeo and Rings. And it speaks about three registers. You know how these things intersect. That's the idea. So we speak about reality, understanding three registers. First, what is real? Real things are the things that happen, even if we don't understand them or see them. It's the physical world. Now, do we have access to the physical world? If you are a fan of the Matrix, like me, you know that we don't. All we have is the interpretation of our senses. So, if you think that what you see and touch is real, then what is real for you is simply a bunch of electronic impulses that your brain is interpreting. We don't have access to the real world. Ask a physicist. They tell you that in the real world, in the physical world, color doesn't exist. It's simply an interpretation of your eyes of how they react to light. So what is real is something we don't have access to. Now, what is symbolic is basically words, language. It's the way we understand the world. It's how we represent the world and make it mean something to us. And we also have the imaginary register, which is based on our creations, on the things that we assume, that we imagine other things are, what we imagine things mean. So maybe, I've been wondering, maybe the virtual is in the middle between imaginary and symbolic. But if you think about it, if I look at you, am I really looking at you, or am I looking at your avatar? When I look at your body and your face and your clothes, am I looking at the essence of you? I'm not. I'm just looking at the image that you decided to show me today. It's your avatar. So in the end, that has been another question I've had. So then, if what I see is just a representation of you, then what is real? So reality is an understanding, is an interpretation of the world that I make. Now, what elements constitute virtual reality? How do we separate virtual reality from factual reality? I'm calling it factual, like reality that in fact happens. First is that virtual reality is not factual, and we know it. And the fact that we know it is really important. That separation, the fact that we know that this reality is not real reality, is one of the most important elements of virtual reality. Because we accept it as an alternate reality that is not as real as real reality, factual reality. So that separation is very important. The fact that we know that it's not real. Second, the number of senses involved for now. For now, in virtual reality, we're using two senses. We're using sight and we're using hearing. For now. Later in the future, we're probably going to use touch, probably smell, maybe taste. It's very possible that these things happen. But for now, we're just using our eyes and our ears. Another difference is that the consequences of the actions in the virtual world don't have lasting consequences on the real world. That means if somebody dies in a movie, that doesn't mean that they die in real life. If you kill somebody in a video game, you're not really killing somebody. I mean, it's just pixels. And if somebody dies in a book, it's not real. That's what it means. So the consequences are not lasting. That means if you try to establish communication in a video game and you fail, nothing happens. You can try again. Okay. Now, what about pedagogy in video games? Because I have already been discussing how apparently many people have learned into using video games. So what has pedagogy and the theory of linguistics said about video games? Apparently, not much. This topic has been mostly neglected. Also, that they have tried to create what they call serious games. When they say serious games, what they're trying to do is tell you it's a game that is not fun because it's educational. You're trying to learn something. So we take the fun away so you can learn. And they use this in the context of education and in the context of work, as work training programs. The problem with serious games is that if you compare them to non-serious games, they are less developed. You don't have the same level of graphics, you don't have the same voice actors, you don't have the same music, the control doesn't work as well, so serious games are actually less serious. They're more serious in purpose, but less serious in development. There's a very famous serious game, I don't know if you ever heard about this, Trace Effects. It's a game that the Department of State of the United States created with the intention of teaching people English. So now, I've been looking for reviews on that experience. And the reviews that I have found from students are, first of all, that people who don't like to play video games will not play it because it's a video game. And people who like video games will not play it because it's a theoretical video game. So it's a game without audience. It does not work because you will not get involved in the reality of the game. And that means it's going to be homework. It's going to feel like homework. And I think homework can be fun, but that one isn't. You have to walk for hours looking for somebody who's going to give you one word, and then you have to walk to the other side of the world to use that word once. It's a game that does not work on the level that they wanted it to work, but they seriously had a good intention. They just didn't know how to execute the idea. So then, after that, we have to say, video games in our society have an immense bias. People have this idea that video games are going to destroy your mind, that they're going to make children violent. So I have to say something about responsible parenting. On the cover of every video game, you have the classification. It says mature in many games, which means not for children. And there are many children in Medellín playing games for adults, which I think it's just like letting your child watch pornography. Like, we understand why that is not okay. So why is it okay to let them play video games that are not age appropriate? I mean, a few days ago I found a kid, 8 years old, playing Grand Theft Auto, a game in which you steal, you plant bombs in cars, you hire prostitutes. It's definitely not for children. And there are children playing. So it's basically about responsible parenting. So the bias about video games comes usually from the misunderstanding. If you buy a game that is age appropriate, a game that says teen is good for teenagers and children. A game that says everyone is good for everyone. Super Mario has no pornography, it has no clear, overt violence. And there are many games that are safe for children, and they can benefit from them very much. So the attempts to use video games in pedagogy have been very cautious. And many people consider video games a waste of time. Just think about this. If you decide to bring a video game to your class, and your boss passes by and sees that your students have a controller in their hands and they're playing in class, the first thing they will think is, they're wasting their time. Why are you not working with your students? Didn't you plan? And maybe you have a great plan, but just the fact that they see a video game in many cases means in their mind that you're wasting your time. Now, there are some conditions for video games to work in the process of learning a language. The most important condition, which is precisely the point in which serious games fail, is the suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief is defined by George Martin as the temporary acceptance as believable of events or characters that would ordinarily be seen as incredible. So it's like when you watch a movie and they show you a dragon. Well, we know that dragons don't exist. So, to be able to suspend your disbelief is to accept that in the world of the movie, that dragon exists. It's to accept that Superman can fly in that world. Well, not in this world. If I take him out of the silver screen, maybe he can't fly. But in that world, he can. If I can accept that, I can suspend my disbelief. You can't imagine how many people I have met who see, they see a dragon, and they say, oh, this movie is stupid. Why? Because that's not real. That means that they have, I think it's a disability. They have this ability to suspend their disbelief. Because that is going to affect many other things. For example, they will not be able to enjoy a book in which they have to imagine things, because they're going to be thinking all the time, but that's not real. And it's very funny, when you ask them what kind of media do you like, they like documentaries, because it's real. Nobody has told them that documentaries in many cases are telling one version of the story. So that is also a suspension of disbelief that you have to make. But still, it feels more believable to them, and that's why they prefer it. So now, when do we use suspension of disbelief? We can use it in movies, we can use it in books, we can use it in video games and TV shows. basically in every virtual context. And this is going to help your brain make connections, not only with the context, because if you accept that the reality that you're facing there is real enough for now, then you can make emotional connections with the characters. The suspension of disbelief is so important because this is the reason you can cry when you're watching a sad movie. This is the reason you can suffer when somebody is in danger in a movie. So when you're able to do this, you get immersed. And immersion, if you think about language learning, immersion is really helpful. When you're in the environment where the language is spoken, immersion really helps. And since we already established that virtual reality and factual reality are not so different, immersion in a virtual world is still immersion. Now, moving on. When we think about fantasy and its function in the human mind, remember I studied psychology. When we think about fantasy in the human mind, I want to go back to Sigmund Freud, when he said that fantasy is not the opposite of seriousness. And when you think of the opposite of fantasy, when people are fantasizing, they're not being not serious. They're just fantasizing. And when they fantasize, they put high levels of emotion into their fantasy. And they take it very seriously. So the opposite of fantasy is not seriousness. The opposite of fantasy is factual reality. Okay, now talking about RPGs. Maybe you saw the term, and some of you don't know what RPG is. It's a role-playing game. This guy, Carl Jensen, defines them as games where the gamer controls a fictional characters or characters that undertakes a quest in an imaginary world. In RPGs, there are many ways to solve a problem, and you make decisions all the time. So you take a very active role in the development of the story, and that's why RPGs were the ones that I chose. Because again, like I told you, this is about virtual interaction, and RPGs are just an example of how it can work. Now, in RPG video games, there are 5 elements that help with language learning. The first element is immersion. So I'm going to develop each one of these elements later, so I'm just going to name them for now. Immersion, interaction, decision-making, the user interface of the game, and the kind of language output that you have to produce. So, when we talk about immersion, we have to say that it happens because of the music, the voice acting, the graphics, and the storytelling. The storytelling, I'm comprising there, the design they make of the entire world, the size of the world, and the scope. How far will you go in that game? There are games that can last, there's one very famous game which I analyzed for this, called Skyrim. Skyrim lasts up to 500 hours. Can you imagine 500 hours of complete immersion in an English-speaking world? In which you're visiting cities. Each city has its own politics, its own economy, its own society, and there are situations happening. It doesn't matter if you go or not, there are things happening. And if you go one time, some things are happening. If you go back 20 hours later, different things are happening. And society has continued moving on. So it's a really complex world in which you get immersed for many hours. RPGs are some of the longest games. I'm spanning from 30 hours, maybe a short RPG, to 500 hours like Skyrim. And there are many plausible endings depending on the decisions that you make. So, I want to give you an example. But there's another detail, which is this. The immersion that you get in these games helps suspend disbelief. I'm going to show you an example of a video game called Mass Effect 2, in which the beginning, this is the opening sequence, you're going to find, I want to pay attention to character development. There are 2 characters having a conversation. And the conversation itself, you can hear the voice acting. I don't remember the name of the actress, but the actor is Martin Sheen. I don't know if you remember Martin Sheen, the father of Charlie Sheen. So I'm going to show you.
Shepard did everything right, more than we could have hoped for. Saving the Citadel, but leaving the Council to die. Humanity's place in the galaxy is stronger than ever, and still it's not enough.
Humans may control the Council, but Shepard remains our best hope.
But they're sending him to fight Geth. Geth. We both know they're not the real threat. The Reapers are still out there.
And it's up to us to stop them.
The Council will never trust Cerberus. They'll never accept our help, even after everything humanity has accomplished. But Shepard, they'll follow him. He's a hero, a bloody icon. But he's just one man. If we lose Shepard, humanity might well follow.
Then see to it that we don't lose him.
Just say, is Shepard a man or a woman?
Man.
Just blurt it out. What do you think? They were talking about Shepard. Man or woman?
It can be both.
Okay, yeah. So you know the game. Now the thing is, many people imagine that the hero has to be a man. But no, I mean, in this game, you can be a man, you can be a woman, you can you can be gay or straight in this game. The level of personalization in this game is incredible. And you are making choices all the time. You can be a good guy or a bad guy. It's up to you. Or you can be something in the middle also. I mean, your decisions are the most important aspect in this game. Another element, so the idea was to talk about immersion. Another element that helps here is interaction. Because first of all, video games are completely player-centered. Everything that is happening in that video game is about the character that you are controlling. So think about pedagogy, student-centered classes. This is 500 hours of student-centered classes. Right? Completely student-centered. Everything happens and revolves around you, around the player. Another thing is that the experiences that you have in these games are task-based. They give you tasks. They give you tasks using language for you to develop them with language or actions, physical actions in the game. Another element is the negotiation of meaning, which is what you're doing when you're interacting with other characters. This can happen, I'm not even talking about online games yet. Even in games that are single-player games, and the people that you're talking to are just artificial intelligence programmed by the programmers. In those cases, you're still negotiating meaning to try to develop the tasks. So those linguistic transactions for communication constitute interaction. And it's virtual interaction. If you suspend your disbelief, it's real for your brain. So it constitutes the same as communicating with native speakers. There are other elements that are going to help you with this. But the idea of interactivity is the defining aspect of video games. And in video games, it's not just about giving the player choices. Because the position of the player is the position of that who plays. So not just a person watching. When people say that in front of a video game you're stupefied, it's just that you're not moving. That's it, but your brain is incredibly active. You never tell people that they are stupefied when they read a book. But it's the same thing. They're disconnected from the rest of the world. Because it's the only way to really imagine what's going on in the book. You need to disconnect from the outside so you can connect to this. Same thing happens when you're watching a movie. Same thing happens when you're playing a video game. So it's not correct when people say that when you're in front of a video game, you're stupefied. Your brain is incredibly active. Your fingers are incredibly active. Maybe the rest of your body is not, and that's something you need to work on. It's all about balance. Exercising is also important. But the thing is, playing a video game is not an activity in which you stupefy your mind. You're activating your mind on a virtual level. Okay. The main actor is, of course, the player, and they give you tasks in many different ways. I'm going to show you a small clip for a game in which they're introducing a task. This game is called The Witcher 3.
We mean you no harm.
I care not at all why you're here. Get out. You. I remember you. From Tirnalia. Remarkable. I thought all elves looked alike to those of your race. If it's Avalach you seek, he's not here. I know. And yet you come here. What for? To spy on him. He tries his damnedest to save you every time you do something stupid. Is that not enough?
What can you possibly know about that?
You'd be surprised. He's told me a great deal about you.
Like what?
He said you shared Lara's features. I don't see whatever it is he sees. It seems a bit like trying to drink water from a mud puddle. But I imagine that belief somehow helps him with his task.
What task?
Do you think he trails you everywhere for pleasure? Even I grow ill at the sight of you.
It's incredible how those like you still believe you're superior to humans, in any way.
She's no human. She's a degenerate half-breed. To have no choice but to use something like that? It's humiliating.
Another word, and I'll...
What? You'll change nothing. She must do what she must. Then Avalach will finally be free of her.
If he hates me so deeply, why didn't he tell me to my face?
Avalok means that much to you.
What's that got to do with anything? If they despise me so, they should leave me be.
Ciri.
What? Do you fear I'll level this place like I did Kaer Morhen? Shame I can't do that at will, because I'd really like to now.
Calm down. The elf was right.
Aren't you supposed to cheer me up?
You carry Lara's gene. Nothing you can do about it. Inherited her talent and her power, too. That she-elf would give up a century of her life to be you.
Certainly didn't seem so.
You were born with a great gift, and only you can decide how to use it.
What's that?
A necklace. Lara Doran's.
It's beautiful, but...
Yours to wear.
Let's go. I'm sick of this place.
So, did you notice the moments of decision making? The moments in which they show you different options and you have to select one. And people react immediately to that. And there are moments in which you can also decide to be silent. And that's why they had a time left to decide. And if you're silent, that also causes a reaction in the other. Just like in the real world. If you don't say anything in a situation like that, then the other person is going to react. Yeah. Now, another aspect which I already kind of touched on in the previous one is decision making. So, I mean, the question is, decision making is a key mechanic in today's games, especially RPGs, role-playing games. It's key for those things. Now, in these games, you're making decisions all the time, and in games, especially RPGs, those decisions are in many cases linguistic. That means you are deciding to say something. There is an entire mission in Mass Effect, which is an action RPG. It happens in space, you're fighting aliens and you're fighting other people and politics and everything. But there's an entire mission which is a trial. So they're trying a person for treason, and you need to defend that person with arguments. You have to argue your way through that mission. So you're making decisions all the time, and the decisions also depend on your ability to select the right language. So you conjugate or you die. Another aspect there is accountability. The decisions you make, they hold you accountable for them in the game. So let's say they give me a mission and I need to save Pablo. I need to save Paula in that mission. And let's say I encounter Paula, but in RPGs, I have the freedom to do whatever I want. So if I decide in that mission that I don't want to save Paula, and I'm going to kill her, if I decide that, when I go back, I am accountable for that. I am accountable for that decision. And in those games, it's very common that your character can go to prison for the crimes committed. If you go to a farm in Skyrim, the one I was telling you about, if you go to a farm in Skyrim and you decide to kill one of the chickens of the farm, the farmers are going to run after you and they're going to call the cops. They will try to arrest you, but if you try to resist arrest, that has more consequences. And you have to pay bail to get out of prison, or you have to find a way to break out of prison. And if you do, then the reward for your capture is even bigger. So you see, you are accountable for your decisions in video games. You're not accountable in real life, and that's why the level of anxiety is not as high as accountability in the real world. Because you know that what you do in the game is not something you're doing in real life. Okay. Another thing is the fact that in video games, the characters that are with you are like characters in a movie or characters in a book. Okay, raise your hands if you have cried with the death of a character in a book or movie. So that means, can you imagine crying for the death of a character in a video game? Okay, gamers understand that. Now think about this. Imagine, okay, in a movie you make a connection with a character for what? 1 hour. Imagine making a connection with a character for 400 hours. They feel like friends. At the end of the game, you know them so well that if they die, it's horrible. And if they die because of a decision you made, it's even worse. And in Mass Effect 2, there's a very famous moment at the end where there is a suicide mission. And you are the commander of a group of 13 people. And if one of them dies, it's on you. It's because you made a bad decision. And the game makes sure that you feel it. Because at the end of the mission in which you were supposed to be victorious, they show the hero, Commander Shepard, next to the coffin of the people who died. If one person died, they show him next to one coffin. If 10 people died, they show the commander next to 10 coffins. And he's there mourning for them. And the music is really sad. So it's a bittersweet ending. It's not happy. It's not a happy ending. I mean, yeah, you did a great thing, but 10 of your friends died. And Mass Effect is a saga. So if you go to Mass Effect 3, you break the decisions that you made in Mass Effect 2 and 1. If somebody died in Mass Effect 2, they are dead in Mass Effect 3. If they survive, they're still alive. And the world changes because they have an influence in the universe. So the thing is, the decisions you make are going to have to weigh heavy on you. And if a character that you really like dies, it feels like a friend dying, just like in a book, just like in a movie. Even more than in a movie, because you have more time to make an attachment to them. Okay. Now, this is one of those instances in which you're making decisions. This is from Mass Effect. So, when you have a conversation, you select the conversation option with your controller. Now, in Mass Effect 3, they integrated one more thing. You can select the options with the microphone that the Kinect has. So that means when a conversation comes in Mass Effect 3, you can put down the controller and just talk. And the game, you read one of the options, the one that you want to say, and the game will continue the conversation using what you said. So it's another level of immersion, it's another level of language use. Now, the user interface is a very important thing in games because it's how we interact with the games. In many games, the idea of the user interface is that we have an augmentation of reality. Just think about this. If you go to Boston, Massachusetts today, and you're talking to people who speak English, and you have subtitles in English all the time while you talk to them, do you think that could help you understand what they're saying? You have that option all the time in video games. Just the fact that you can have the subtitles, and have 2 points of reference to understand what they're saying. Instead of just you're listening, you have listening and reading to understand what they say. It helps you build vocabulary, become familiar with new expressions. It's exposure. It's a gigantic level of exposure you get with this kind of context. So the augmentation of reality, it happens through the online displays, or the on-screen displays that you have. And basically the user interface is a set of commands or menus through which the user can communicate with a program. So a command-driven interface is an interface in which you enter commands. A menu-driven interface is one in which you select options from a menu. Okay, so can you imagine, I told you about this, like traveling with a UI, a user interface, something that helps you. Or just think about traveling with a GPS, having a map all the time on your eyes, showing you where you're going. And that is something you have all the time in video games. The user interface is making your life easier. There are different types of UI, so I'm going to show you a few examples. In conversation, this is from Skyrim, you have this kind of user interface. You have the character you're talking to, and maybe in this case the name, and you have options of dialogue. All the options are correct. It's not like select the correct option, grammatically speaking. In real life, you're never trying to select the correct option. In real life, you're trying to communicate. Now here, they're giving you the correct expressions. And after using them for 500 hours, you become so familiar with them that you can use them in other contexts. And that's what we call meaningful learning, right? Now, another context is the inventory, which is one of my favorite things of these games. You have an inventory in which you have lots of objects that you start picking up. It feels like you're picking up garbage. And sometimes one of the things in which you have to suspend your disbelief is the fact that they're carrying so many things and they can still walk. Because they're carrying weapons, they're carrying shields, they're carrying food, they're carrying trays, plates, and they can still walk. So you have to suspend your disbelief there. But when you look at your inventory, a very nice thing is that you have a 3D rendering of the object, and you have the name. And you see them many times, so it helps you build vocabulary all the time. Another one is character creation. When you're creating a character, you have different facial features, the physical features of the character. So you're there looking at vocabulary. And when you toggle the options, like you say, for example, eyelashes color, you toggle the options and you see the eyelashes changing color. So you have visual feedback on your attempts to interact with the language. And you have immediate feedback on those things. So it's very easy to start testing your theories, testing your hypotheses, and start just absorbing the vocabulary. Another thing is when you're interacting with interactive elements of the game. Like in this scene, this is from Assassin's Creed. In this game, there's a moment in which the hero gets home and he finds his master, his mentor, dying. And he finds that he left a letter for him. So then they show this scene where he goes to a cemetery and he has the body of the mentor wrapped in sheets and he's reading the letter. It's a very emotional moment. And you have these prompts on the screen. Press X to dig. So let's imagine you don't know what dig is. You press X and he starts digging. You can see it immediately. You get immediate feedback. And the letter continues. You can hear the voice of the master that's still speaking. Okay. This is view of the user interface in combat. So you have different information in combat. The controls that you can use with the names of the actions that they perform. So again, you have the visual feedback of what you're trying to do. You have the health bar of the enemy, the health bar of your hero, different powers that you can use. You have the map with active missions. Mission markers, that you have a compass, some variation of action points or stamina. All of this is augmented reality. If you were fighting this monster in real life, you wouldn't have all that information. Nobody would be telling you, hey, you can use this power, or you can use this skill. Nobody would be telling you that. So here they're helping you with visual cues or linguistic cues. Okay. Now, there's another element of video games that helps language learning. Just analyze the user interface. The language outputs, which is basically guided exchanges. You You have a conversation in which the other people are not helping you with the language. They're just saying things. And you have a guided exchange. That means you have different options that you can select from. And the different options have different effects because they usually reflect different attitudes of the speaker. So you're selecting those things according to your attitudes in the conversation. And the desired options are based on meaning. They're not based on correctness. So if you in your mind have an idea, and the idea is grammatically incorrect, and you select the option that is kind of similar to that, they're showing you the correct spelling, the correct grammar, but they're helping you with the meaning. They're helping you find meaning, and then give you feedback on the correct form. But it's not that they're focusing on your grammar, you're trying to communicate and they're interrupting you to point out your grammar mistakes. Okay, another kind of language output is how you show your understanding. They give you a linguistic cue and you respond with physical action, with physical responses. This is basically a nod back to TPR, total physical response. Remember that methodology? And again, like I told you before about Mass Effect, they have started using voice commands. So, like I told you, in Mass Effect you have the conversation, yeah. But then also in combat, you're always fighting with two friends. In the middle of the fight, you can start giving them commands with your voice. You can say, Miranda, move up. And she's going to move to the position you're pointing. You don't have to use a controller for those things, you can use your voice. So those things, at the beginning, it takes some time getting used to it because it's vocabulary. But after 90 hours of doing it, you become really used to that vocabulary and those expressions. Okay. Now, I want to make some conclusions on this talk. We've had a lot of fun, but we have a limited amount of time. So I want to make some conclusions. This is what I reached in my master's thesis. Conclusions on the gaming community, on virtual interaction, and on this fight that linguistics have always had between acquisition and conscious learning. So the first conclusion is about the gaming community. First of all, the gaming community is mostly English speakers. Second, it's a process that happens through acquisition. It's a natural acquisition that happens just because they're playing the game. And it's incredibly effective. You can't imagine how many gamers speak English. Another one is, in many cases, gamers are disenchanted with English classes because they feel that the game was a lot more effective. So when they go to an English class and they see the teacher is explaining comparatives today, they're like, oh my god, this is so not authentic. The game is more authentic. So there is this disenchantment with English classes, and they have the ability to suspend disbelief. I don't know if you have ever taught. I guess many of your students, but many of you may also be teachers already. I don't know if you have had students who are gamers. The gamers usually have a higher level. Another thing is that gamers are very demanding about the content that they play. So you cannot give them a stupid educational game and expect that they're going to be happy. If you want to give them a game, it has to be a good game. It has to have a good story, it has to have good graphics, good character development, and many of the other things we have been talking about, immersion, music. Right now, musicians, famous musicians are composing music for video games. Famous actors are lending their voices to video games. Very famous actors who are typically in video games are, for example, Mark Hamill, the guy who acts as Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. He's very famous for his voice acting as the Joker in the Batman games. He's an amazing Joker. There's also Gary Oldman, very famous for games like Call of Duty. Carrie-Anne Moss, Trinity, The Matrix. She's also been doing lots of voice acting. And there are many other actors doing voice acting for video games. About virtual interaction, which is the central point of this talk. First, it's significant for the brain. The brain accepts it as real as long as you suspend your disbelief. The brain accepts it as real, so it's meaningful for the brain. That means it can be used to learn the language. Second, it gives you comprehensible input, especially because of all the augmentation of reality, all the other clues that the game gives you. It makes it comprehensible. It helps you understand the input. There is no confusion. You don't confuse reality and fantasy. Many people believe that if you play a video game, you can start confusing reality and fantasy. The name of that is schizophrenia, and you have it or you don't. So a game is not going to make you schizophrenic. Now, you may have a pre-existing condition that the game triggers, but anything can trigger schizophrenia. So it's not that video games make you crazy. Yeah, anything. Like somebody saying hello can trigger a schizophrenia. A book can trigger a schizophrenia. So it's not really about the video game itself. And the paranoia that people have with video games today is the same paranoia that our grandparents had with our parents with TVs. And the same paranoia that our great-grandparents had with their grandparents with fantasy books. They believed that these things were going to make people crazy. And you know how people said women shouldn't read because that gives them ideas? It's the same paranoia. And hey, I mean, women having ideas, I think it's a great thing. And women have great ideas. So, that's out of the point. Now, there is a lot of authentic emotion happening in video games. It lowers the affective filter because you know that the consequences are not lasting. So, the affective filter is lower. And your survival is not at stake in a video game. So, the fact that you make mistakes in public, it doesn't happen because you're not in public. If you're in a video game playing with your screen, and if you make a mistake, nobody cares. So the affective filter is lower, and that helps you learn the language. And also, people who develop the habit of playing these games, they are very autonomous in the process of learning. They start finding enjoyment. So they find strategies that are really useful for them to continue learning. On acquisition versus conscious learning, we have to say that in video games, you have an incredible investment on time and emotion. This concept of virtual interaction can help you understand why people invest so much time in video games. It's because you experience very significant emotions in that, just like when you watch a great movie. You experience great emotion with that. You get incredible character development in some games. Of course, not every game is great, but in great games you have very, very strong emotions. Also, learning happens incidentally. It's something that happens while you're doing something else. It's like you're going to take a course on biology in the United States. You're learning about biology, but along the way, without noticing, you're learning English. So it happens incidentally. It doesn't have to be conscious. Another thing is that educational games, the problem until now is that in their development, it's very difficult to suspend your disbelief because we already have a point of reference with the other games that are highly developed. So with them, it's harder. It's like when you watch a movie with bad special effects. It's harder to believe. It's harder to believe what they're presenting. If there's a monster, but you can see the mask. If there is a Gladiator movie, and you can see the Rolex in his hand, it breaks through your suspension of disbelief. So with bad video games, or with educational video games, what has happened so far is that they don't help you suspend your disbelief. Another thing is that the idea of serious games defeats the purpose. Because a serious game, taking away the emotion, taking away the fun, taking away the story, you're taking away the elements that help you connect with the game. Because of that, they fail in the process of teaching you something that is long-lasting. And finally, the focus on the game world is task-based. You're doing tasks. You're not focused on learning the language. So it's not an idea of conscious learning. They're never giving you a mission to understand the present perfect. They're giving you a mission to complete a mission. And in the mission, you may learn about the present perfect without knowing. It's task-based completely. And that's all I wanted to say to you guys. Thanks a lot.